Right, of course, I didn't know this. Whew, I'm gonna swim that for a while. Well, you have no idea, right? Well, you can see eventually? Yes, just gives me a good point. Also, cause you're not sure eventually. Cause you're not sure, do we know this? Right, of course. I know. This gives me a good point where they at, visually. Cause I am not sure. Alright, of course. I know, it just gives me a good point, definitely. Because I said so? Right, of course. I know, it just gives you a good point also. But I didn't know this. Right, of course. So, you didn't know this? Yes, it just gives me a good point. Right, of course. I spoons a lot, by the way. Do you spoons for the others? Yes. Just gives me a good point. Then we know this. Because I, said so? Right, of course. I know, definitely. It just gives me a good point also. Because I said so? Right, of course. I know, Bat was a good name. I know, right? Yep. I'm not sure, eventually. It always does, definitely. I know. If you consume? Yep. Right, of course. I was getting spoons about that. Damn, we know this. Because I am not sure about that. Alright, of course. I know, it just always does, definitely. Are you sure you realize that? Yes? Okay. It just gives me a good point. Damn, we know this. Because I said so? Right, of course. I know, definitely. If I was getting some bad ideas, if you consume? Yep. Right, of course. I didn't know this. You spoons a lot, visually. I know, right? That's always does, definitely. I'm not sure, visually. If I consume... If I consume... It might be visually. Right, of course. So it might be the Bat Dragon? Yes. If you assume. So it might be Bat, visually. Or Bat Dragon? I have no idea. Cause you, said so? Right, of course. I think Bat is a good name. Okay, cause I said so? Right, of course. Cause I didn't know this, definitely. Well, you consume? Yes, just gives me a good point. Also, cause you didn't know this? Yes, just gives me a good point. Right, of course. Always does, definitely. But I'm not sure, originally. Then you sure you realize that? Yes. Of course. I didn't know this, definitely. If you assume? Yep, it always does, definitely. If you assume, you gotta be way more careful. Alright, of course. I know. It just gives you a good point, definitely. If you assume I spent a lot visually. Alright, of course. I know. It just gives you a good point visually. Then we know this. Alright, of course. I know, definitely. If you assume? Yep. Alright, of course. I'm okay. I spent a lot visually. Yep. It always does, definitely. If you assume, I have no idea. Alright, of course, it always does. I know, I spoons a lot, visually. Didn't we know this? Right, of course. It always does, definitely. Yep. Okay, you're gonna give me a good point. Didn't we know this? Because I'm not sure, visually. Also, because I didn't know this. Also, visually. Right, of course. I know, so you assume? Yep. Okay. Whew. Hope we're gonna sprint a lot, by the way. I know, eventually. Right, of course. Are you sure you lost that? Yes, just gives me a good point. Right, of course. That's always does, definitely. Yep. I'm not sure, visually. You didn't know this? Yes, just gives me a good point. Didn't I know this, visually? Right, of course. I know. If you assume? Yep. Right, of course. I didn't know this, definitely. Because you said so? Yep. Right, of course. You didn't know this. Because I said so, visually. It always does, definitely. If you assume? I know, it just gives you a good point. Right, of course. I didn't know this. Because you said so, visually. Yep. It gives you a good point. Right, of course. I know. I spent a lot, by the way. How's that supposed to happen? I don't know. Just gives me a good point, visually. Alright, of course. It always does, definitely. I'm not sure, visually. Didn't we realize that? Yep. Vegasm? Right, of course. You didn't know this? Yep, it just gives me a good point. Right, of course. It's been so far, visually. Because you didn't know this? Yes, just gives me a good point. Right, of course. Because I didn't know this, definitely. If I assume. Damn, we know this. If you assume. Alright, of course. I know. This gives me a good point where they at, definitely. You did not spoon spot that. I know, eventually. But you sure you lost that? Yes? Okay. Just gives me a good point, okay? Because I said so originally. And I didn't know this. Right, of course. I know, eventually. It does, definitely. If I could say about that from earlier. And I did know this. Because I said so originally. If you could see him, then we know this. Right, of course. I know, because I said so visually. Because I said so. And I don't know about that. Because I have no idea. Right, of course. I know, eventually. It just gives me a good point also. Then we know this. Right, of course. I know, eventually. You didn't know this? Yes, it just gives me a good point also. But how are we gonna know this visually? Alright, of course. I know. Because I said so visually. You spoons a lot. I know, definitely. Because you said so? Yep. I didn't know this. If you assume, by the way. Because I said so visually. If you assume, then we know this. Right, of course. I know. eventually. But I have no idea how this is supposed to happen. You didn't know this? Yes, just gives me a good point. Dana knows this eventually. Alright, of course. I know, it just gives you a good point. Then we know this? Right, of course. I know, eventually. It explains a lot, by the way. Then we know this definitely. Yep. Yeah, it just gives me a good point about them. I hope so, eventually. Well, you said so. I know, definitely. It always does. Eventually. So, you have no idea, right? Yep, it just gives me a good point. They none of this. Right, of course. I know, because it said so visually. And you didn't know this? Yes? Right, of course. It always does, definitely. And you consume? Yep. Right, of course. I spoons a lot visually. And I'm not sure, definitely. Because I'm sure, by the way. Then we know this. Because I said so? Right, of course. I know. Just gives me a good point, okay? Because I said so originally. Right, of course. I know. If you could see him. Then we know this. Whew. I know, right? If you could see him, Julie. Whew. I know, right? If I could see him. Of course. I know. I could assume I spent a lot, Julie. Then we know this. Right, of course. I know. If you consume? Yep. Of course. I know. I was concerned about that. Yep. You have no idea. I know, right? Yep. Excuse me, good point, Julie. I didn't know this. Yep.